She signed her name next to a stranger's on a marriage certificate, not for love, not for hope, but because the bank was going to take everything her father had bled for. Evelyn Carter married Daniel Hart on the coldest morning Red Hollow had ever seen, with no flowers, no vows that meant anything, and no witnesses except a bored clerk who smelled like tobacco and didn't bother looking up. She told herself it was just a transaction. She was wrong, because somewhere beneath the rotting floorboards of an old barn, 15 years of silence were waiting to destroy her. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. Let me see how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one's going to take a while. The morning Evelyn Carter got married, the sky looked like the inside of a tin bucket, flat, gray, and cold enough to make a person forget what warmth ever felt like. She had not slept, not the night before, not the night before that. For the past 2 weeks, she had been running on black coffee, stubborn pride, and a kind of desperate arithmetic that kept adding up to the same impossible sum. Not enough. Not enough money. Not enough time. Not enough options left on the table. She stood in front of the small mirror above her wash basin, pinning her dark hair back with hands that wouldn't quite stay still. The reflection staring back at her was 26 years old, but it looked older. It looked like a woman who had learned, in the span of a single brutal autumn, that the world did not care much for fairness. Her father, Thomas Carter, had died 7 weeks ago. He had died quietly, the way he had lived, without drama, without complaint. In the narrow bed by the window, he had always said, "Let in the best morning light." He'd gone in his sleep, which the town doctor called a mercy, though Evelyn couldn't decide if she agreed with that or not. A mercy for him, maybe. For her, it had been the beginning of a catastrophe that unfolded in slow motion, one terrible letter at a time. The first letter came from the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne 4 days after the funeral. The second came 10 days later. The third, hand-delivered by a man in a brown coat who wouldn't meet her eyes, arrived the morning she buried the last of the season's feed money, paying off her father's medical debt. The sum total of what Thomas Carter owed was not extraordinary. It was not the kind of debt that ruined dynasties or filled newspapers. It was the ordinary, grinding kind, a loan taken out 3 years ago to survive a bad winter, rolled over once, then twice, then a third time with interest compounding like a slow fire in dry grass. By the time Evelyn understood the full shape of it, the number had grown large enough to swallow the ranch whole. $412. She had written it down on a piece of paper and stared at it for an hour, as if staring might change it. It didn't. The bank wanted full repayment within 60 days of Thomas Carter's death, per the terms of the original agreement, a clause her father had apparently signed without reading, or perhaps without believing he would ever actually die. 60 days. Evelyn had counted them out on the calendar like a woman counting the steps to a gallows. She had tried everything she could think of, in the order she could think of it. She had written to her father's brother in Missouri, a man named Gerald who ran a dry goods store and had 3 children and a wife who had never liked the Carters much. Gerald had written back promptly, sympathetically, and uselessly. "Times are hard everywhere, Evelyn. I wish I could do more." She had spoken to every rancher in the valley about selling some of the herd. The cattle market was down. Everyone knew it. The men she spoke to were not unkind, but they were businessmen first, and the prices they offered were insults dressed up as charity. She had gone to the bank itself, to a man named Harlan Briggs, who had a large mustache and a small soul, and asked about an extension. Briggs had looked at her the way men like him always looked at women in her position, like a problem that had wandered in off the street and was now inconveniently sitting in his chair. "Miss Carter," he had said, with a patience that was somehow more offensive than anger would have been, "the terms of the loan were agreed upon by your father. I understand your situation is difficult, but the bank has obligations of its own." "His name was Mr. Carter," she had said quietly, "and I'm Mrs. Carter now, as of last week." That had surprised him. "You've remarried?" "I've married," she corrected. "Once is enough." She had walked out of his office before he could ask anything else. The man she had married was named Daniel Hart. She had known him for exactly 11 days before the wedding. She was not sure, even now, standing in front of her mirror on the morning of the ceremony, that she could describe him accurately to a stranger. He was tall, that much was certain. broad-shouldered in a way that suggested years of physical work rather than any particular vanity about it. His hair was dark, starting to silver at the temples in a way that put him somewhere in his mid-30s, though he had the kind of face that weathered rather than aged, so it was hard to be precise. His eyes were brown or gray. She genuinely could not decide. She had looked at them directly only twice, once when he made his offer and once when she accepted it, and both times she had been too focused on what he was saying to pay attention to the color of the eyes saying it. He had appeared in Red Hollow 3 weeks ago, arriving on the afternoon stage from the east with 2 saddlebags and a horse that had already been stabled at the livery, which meant he had been planning this trip for a while, had sent the horse ahead, had thought it through. That detail had struck Evelyn as significant, though she hadn't been able to articulate why at the time. He had gone to see Harlan Briggs first. She learned this later. He had gone to the bank, asked about the Carter debt, and been given the full accounting of it without, as far as she could tell, Briggs feeling any particular obligation to inform her. Then he had come to the ranch. She had been in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horse, and she had kept splitting wood while he introduced himself, because she was behind on every physical task the property demanded, and she had learned not to stop working just because company arrived. "My name is Daniel Hart," he had said. "I knew your father some years back. I was sorry to hear about his passing." "Thank you," she had said, and brought the axe down. "I have a proposition for you, if you're willing to hear it." She had set the axe in the stump and turned to look at him then, not because she was particularly interested, but because something in the way he said proposition was different from the way other men said it. There was no performance in it, no careful winding up, just the word, offered plainly, like a tool placed on a workbench. "I'm listening," she said. "I'd like to buy this ranch," he said, "not to take it from you. I'd like to pay off the bank debt in full and take the ranch in partnership, with you remaining on the property and retaining full management of the household and livestock decisions. In exchange, I would contribute the capital needed to settle the loan and fund operations through the next 2 seasons. She had stared at him. "That's not a partnership," she said. "That's a purchase." "I know," he said, "which is why I'm also proposing a marriage." The word landed between them with no particular ceremony. He didn't look embarrassed by it. He didn't look hopeful either. He looked exactly the same as he had looked a moment before, steady, present, waiting. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough to make the offer," he said. "Why?" He had been quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man searching for a lie, she had thought, but of one choosing how much of the truth to offer. "I have money," he said finally. "I have worked for 15 years to have it. I have no family. I have no land of my own. I have been looking for a place to put down roots for a long time, and this valley is where I want them." He paused. "Your ranch is the finest piece of land in the valley, and you appear to be someone who would not waste it." It was, objectively, the least romantic proposal in the history of Red Hollow. She had made him wait 3 days for her answer. She had spent those 3 days trying to find any alternative she hadn't yet tried. There wasn't one. On the 4th morning, she had walked to the boarding house where he was staying and knocked on the door. "I have conditions," she said when he opened it. "Tell me," he said. "Separate rooms," she said. "My father's room stays mine. You take the hired hand's quarters off the back of the house. We are partners in the management of this land and nothing else. You do not make decisions about this property without consulting me. You do not invite people here without my knowledge. And you do not—" She had paused because this part felt important enough to say slowly. "You do not pretend to be something this is not, to me or to anyone else." He had considered each point as she laid it down, like a man counting coins. "Agreed," he said. "All of it." "Then I'll marry you," she said. "But I want it understood. This is a practical arrangement, not a promise." "I understand," he said. She had believed him. The ceremony took place at the county courthouse in Red Hollow, in a room that smelled like dust and old paper and the ghost of 1,000 transactions that had nothing to do with love. The justice of the peace was a thin man named Warren Holt, who read the words from a book with the enthusiasm of a man cataloging fence posts. There were no flowers, there were no guests, There was only Evelyn in her good gray dress, not her best, because her best was for occasions that meant something, and Daniel in a clean white shirt with his hat in his hands, and Warren Holt with his book, and the board clerk who smelled like tobacco and didn't bother looking up from his ledger until it was time to witness the signatures. Warren Holt said the words. Daniel said I do in a voice that was quiet and even. Evelyn said I do in a voice that was the same. They did not look at each other when they said it. Or rather, Evelyn did not look at him, and when she finally did glance sideways, she found that he was not looking at her either, but at the window, where the gray morning sky pressed against the glass like something that had nowhere else to go. She signed her name, Evelyn Hart, in letters that felt strange and foreign beneath her pen. He signed his name, Daniel Hart, in handwriting that was clean and careful and oddly deliberate, like a man who had thought for a long time about what that signature meant. And that was that. Well, the ride back to the ranch was silent, not uncomfortably so. Or at least that was what Evelyn told herself. Daniel drove the wagon with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to apply to everything, and Evelyn sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and watched the road. The cottonwoods along the creek had already gone gold, and their leaves were coming down in slow, spinning spirals that the wind scattered before they could land anywhere in particular. I'll start on the fence line along the north pasture tomorrow, Daniel said, when they were half a mile from the ranch gate. I noticed 3 sections down when I rode the property last week. We'll lose cattle through there before the first snow, if it's not repaired. I know about the fence, Evelyn said. I had it on my list. I figured, he said. I just wanted to let you know my plan so it wouldn't be a surprise. She looked at him sideways. You said you'd consult me before making decisions. I'm consulting you now, he said. Does the north fence work for tomorrow, or would you rather I start somewhere else? She turned back to the road. North fence is fine, she said. Good, he said. That was the whole conversation. He was, she had to admit, reluctantly, privately, in the accounting she kept inside her head, extraordinarily competent. Within the first week, he had repaired the north fence and the east gate, re-roofed the corner of the barn that had been leaking since spring, reset 3 fence posts that had heaved out of the frozen ground, and dug out the drainage ditch behind the chicken coop that had been causing flooding in the south yard every time it rained. He worked from before dawn until after dark without complaint or commentary. He did not ask her to admire what he was doing. He did not report to her each evening with a list of accomplishments as if expecting a grade. He simply worked, steadily and silently, and the results accumulated around her like evidence of a case being made. She cooked twice a day because that was what she had always done, and because she had no intention of letting anyone else manage her kitchen. She left a plate for him each meal at the far end of the table. He ate what was put in front of him without comment, cleaned his own dishes, and retreated to his quarters with a book, or without one. She couldn't always tell. They spoke functionally, about the cattle, about the weather coming in from the northwest, about whether the price of hay in town had come down yet. It hadn't. About which section of pasture needed rotating before it got too cold. He never crossed the line she had drawn. Not once. She told herself she appreciated that. She told herself it was exactly what she had wanted. At night, lying in her father's narrow bed with the wind working at the window seams, she listened to the silence of the house and tried to identify what it was exactly that she felt. Not happy. She had not expected to be happy. Happiness had not been part of the terms. Not unhappy, either. Not quite. More like standing on the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of, in the dark, with no particular reason to move. It was on a Saturday, 3 weeks and 2 days into the marriage, that she found the box. She had been cleaning the barn, a thorough, seasonal cleaning, the kind her father used to do every autumn before the serious cold set in. She had already swept the hayloft, reorganized the tack room, checked the grain bins for moisture damage, and was working on the main floor when she noticed it. She almost missed it. She had walked over that spot 100 times, had swept over it just minutes before, but there was something about the way the light was falling through the high south window that caught the edge of the loose board at a different angle than usual. A slight rise. A separation at one end, barely wider than a thumbnail. She would have left it. She almost did. There was still half the barn to finish, and the light would be gone in 3 hours. And she had promised herself she would have the whole thing done before dark. But the edge of the board caught the light again, and she stopped. She set down the broom. She crouched, worked her fingers under the edge of the board, and pulled. It came up with a groan of old nails, releasing a smell of cold earth and something else. Paper, she would think later. The specific smell of paper that has been held and folded and held again, many times, by careful hands. The tin box was small, the kind of box that might have held tobacco or sewing supplies, or the kind of small objects a person kept because they couldn't bring themselves to throw them away. It was rusted at the corners, its lid sealed by years of damp and pressure, and it had no markings on the outside except a series of small dents that looked almost deliberate. The kind of marks a thing gets when it has been set down and picked up and set down again, thoughtfully, by someone who kept coming back to it. She sat on the cold barn floor with the box in her lap and looked at it for a long moment. She told herself she had no reason to open it. It wasn't hers. It was old. Whatever was inside was none of her business. She opened it. Wham! The letters were folded small, each one nested inside the next like a set of diminishing things, and there were more of them than she expected, far more than the small box should have been able to hold, as if they had been compressed deliberately, pressed down to take less space. There were 15 of them. She counted before she unfolded the first one. The paper was thin, the kind that came in cheap pads from the general store. The handwriting was young, not in a childish way, but in the way of a person who had learned to write carefully and had not yet stopped being careful about it. Each letter was clear and deliberate, slanting slightly to the right, with the occasional word crossed out and rewritten above the line. The first one was dated. She looked at the year and did the arithmetic automatically, the way a rancher always does with dates and numbers. She had been 11 when this was written. She read it slowly. I don't expect you'll ever read this. I'm not sure why I'm writing it, except that there doesn't seem to be anywhere else to put these thoughts. And if I keep carrying them, they're going to get too heavy to manage. You smiled at me today when you brought out the noon water. You didn't mean anything by it. You smile at everyone that way. But I've been thinking about it since this morning, and I expect I'll still be thinking about it tomorrow, which is a problem I don't know how to solve. I am 12 years old. You are 11. I have no business thinking about anything other than getting through the day's work without getting fired. But here I am. I figure I'll be moved on by spring. Ranch hands always are. So I'll put this away in a tin box in the barn and leave it here when I go, because it doesn't seem right to carry feelings that don't belong to me. Evelyn set the letter down on her knee. She picked up the next one. It was dated 3 years later. The handwriting had grown, steadier, more confident, but with the same careful rightward slant. I came back through the valley this summer. I told myself I had no reason to stop. I told myself that 3 times between the creek crossing and the north gate, and then I stopped anyway. You were in the yard with your father, going over the books, I think. You were arguing about something. You were losing, but you didn't look like you knew that yet. I watched from the road for about as long as I could justify standing still, and then I kept writing. I don't know if you'd remember me. I was 12 the summer I worked here. Boys that age are mostly invisible. I think about this land more than is reasonable. I think about you more than is reasonable. Both of those things are equally true and equally inconvenient. She read them all. It took a long time. The light in the barn shifted, dimmed, and she lit the lantern without putting the letters down, reading by its unsteady yellow glow, while the wind worked the walls and the horses shifted in their stalls. The letters spanned 15 years. Not every year. There were gaps, sometimes of 2 or 3 years at a stretch, when the writer seemed to have disappeared entirely, and then reappeared with a different address in the heading and some new piece of landscape to describe. He had worked his way across the territory, gathering skills and money and years with the same quiet patience with which he seemed to do everything. He had worked cattle drives in Montana, a mining operation in Colorado, a freight company in Kansas. He had bought land, lost it in a flood, started again. He had built a life piece by piece, the way you build a life when you have no one to help you and no inherited advantages to fall back on. But through all of it, threaded through every letter like a line of color through gray cloth, was the same constant thing. I passed back through Wyoming last autumn. I rode out to the valley, which is a habit I cannot seem to break and have given up trying to. Your father's herd looks strong. The east pasture has been improved. Someone has been working hard. I hear you are doing well. I hear that from no one in particular, and with no real right to care. But I do. The later letters were different from the early ones, quieter, more measured. The younger letters had a specific kind of ache to them, the ache of a person pressing against a feeling too large to hold. The later ones had settled into something else, something harder to name. Not resignation, exactly. More like patience that had become structural, had built itself into the bones of the person carrying it. The last letter was different from all the others. It was not dated like the rest. It was written on better paper, not the cheap pad kind, but the heavy cream kind that came in a sealed envelope. And it was shorter than any of the others, barely half a page. I heard the news about Thomas Carter 3 days ago. I have no right to be here. I know that. I have no claim on anything connected to you or that land, and I have never pretended otherwise. But I also know what that bank will do, and I know the shape of the debt, and I have done the arithmetic twice to make sure. I can help. That's all I want to say. I can help, if you'll allow it, in whatever arrangement makes sense to you. I have the money, and I have the patience, and I have no pride to speak of when it comes to this. If the answer is no, I'll understand. I'll go back to wherever I came from, and you'll never have to think about me again. If the answer is something other than no, I will be in Red Hollow at the boarding house for as long as it takes. I have waited 15 years to be useful to you. I can wait a little longer. D. Evelyn sat on the cold barn floor for a long time after she finished reading. The lantern had burned low. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, a low, grieving sound she had grown up hearing and had never entirely made peace with. She looked at the last letter for a long time. She looked at the signature. D. She thought about the way he had come to her that first day, arriving without announcement, with his proposal already formed, already reasoned out, already stripped of everything that might look like need or sentiment or want. She had read it as professionalism, as a man who had done his homework and made his case. She thought about the way he said, "I have waited 15 years," and felt the weight of those words shift and rearrange into something completely different from what she had thought they meant when she agreed to marry him. She had married a stranger. She had not married a stranger. And the distance between those two things was 15 years deep and sitting in a rusted tin box in her lap, and she did not know, she genuinely, completely did not know, what she was supposed to do with any of it. She folded each letter back into its original shape. She put them back in the box in the order she'd found them. She closed the lid. She sat with the box held against her chest in the cold barn for a long time, listening to the wind and to the horses and to the distant ordinary sounds of a man doing evening chores around the property she had agreed to share with him. The creak of the water trough, the clank of a tool being set down, the soft fall of footsteps across frozen ground. A man who had worked on her father's ranch when he was 12 years old. A man who had ridden back through this valley every few years for 15 years and never once knocked on the door. A man who, when he finally did knock, had made her the most practical, unsentimental, clear-eyed offer she had ever received. And meant every word of it. And meant considerably more than the words. She pressed the tin box harder against her chest and closed her eyes. 15 years, she thought. The word for what she was feeling didn't exist yet in any language she knew. It was something between vertigo and grief and a kind of terrible tenderness, and it sat in the center of her chest like a stone dropped into deep water still falling. She stayed in that barn for a long time, long after the lantern burned out, long after the stars came out overhead through the gap in the roof she had asked him to fix and he had not yet gotten to, long after the property went quiet and the light went out in the room at the back of the house, where a man she had married for practical reasons was going about the end of his evening, alone, not knowing what she had found, not knowing that the 15 years he had spent being invisible had just, in a single gray autumn hour, become completely and irrevocably seen. She sat in the dark with the letters against her chest, and she felt the ground beneath her feet shift into something she did not yet have a name for. She put the tin box back under the floorboard. That was the first thing she did. Before she stood up, before she brushed the cold dirt from her skirt, before she even let herself breathe properly. She put the box back exactly where she had found it, pressed the loose board down until the nails caught, and then stood up and picked up the broom and finished sweeping the barn. She did not know why. It was not a decision she made consciously. It was more like a reflex, the same reflex that made her keep her face still when Harlan Briggs talked down to her at the bank, the same one that had kept her upright at her father's graveside when every muscle in her body had wanted to fold. Something in her understood, before the rest of her had caught up, that she needed time before this became real, before she allowed it to become a thing that existed between her and Daniel Hart. It needed to exist inside her long enough for her to understand its shape. And she did not understand its shape, not yet. So she swept. She finished the barn floor in clean, even strokes, moving from the back wall to the door the way her father had taught her. Always finish what you start, Evie, because a half-done thing is worse than an undone one. She hung the broom on its nail. She closed the barn door behind her. She walked across the dark yard to the house with the cold wind at her back, and she made supper, and she put a plate at the far end of the table, and she ate her own meal standing at the kitchen window, the way she sometimes did when she needed to see the land to feel steady. Daniel came in at his usual time. He removed his hat at the door. He sat at the far end of the table without being asked. He ate without commentary. He cleared his plate, washed it, set it on the drying rack. "Cold coming in," he said at the door to the back hallway, which was the extent of their evening exchange most nights. "I know," she said. "I'll bank the kitchen fire before I turn in." "I already checked the horses," he said. "Put extra bedding in the stalls." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and was gone. She stood at the window for a long time after his footsteps faded down the back hallway, listening to the familiar sounds of him settling in for the night, the low groan of the cot, the particular silence that followed when a person had stopped moving. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and looked out at the barn, its dark shape just visible in the starlight, and thought about the box beneath the floor and the 15 years inside it. "I have waited 15 years to be useful to you." She took her hand off the glass. She banked the fire. She went to bed. She did not sleep. The next 3 days were an exercise in the specific torture of knowing something you cannot unknow. Evelyn went about her work with the systematic focus that had always been her best defense against things she wasn't ready to face. She fed and watered the livestock. She mended a section of the fence along the south pasture that had been pulling away from the post. She inventoried the root cellar and made a list of what they would need from town before the first serious snow. She wrote out the week's figures in the ledger her father had kept and she had inherited, running her finger down the columns of numbers with the kind of concentration that leaves no room for anything else. But the letters followed her, not the physical letters. Those were still under the floorboard in the barn, still folded in their original shapes, still held in a rusted box that she had not gone back to touch. The letters in her mind were the ones that followed her. Fragments surfaced at the worst moments, while she was measuring out grain, while she was checking the cattle for signs of the cough that had been moving through the valley, while she was lying in the dark of her father's room with the wind at the window. "You smiled at me today when you brought out the noon water. You didn't mean anything by it." She had been 11 years old. She could not, no matter how hard she pressed her memory, produce any image of a 12-year-old boy working her father's land that summer. She had been 11, and summers at that age were not about ranch hands. They were about the creek and the horses and the particular golden slowness of days that seemed to stretch forever. Ranch hands came and went. That was the nature of the work. You did not track them. You brought water at noon because your mother or your father told you to, and you smiled because that was what you did when you handed someone something, and then you went back to being 11 years old in a summer that felt like it would never end. And somewhere in that unremarkable summer, a 12-year-old boy had put a feeling in a tin box and buried it under the floorboards, and built his entire life around the weight of it. She was crouching in the root cellar counting the potato stores when the full absurdity of her situation landed on her all at once. She sat down on the cold dirt floor, a thing she seemed to be doing in a lot of cold places lately, and pressed her hands against her face. She was married to him. She had married him. She had gone to the courthouse in her gray dress and said "I do" and signed her name, and the whole time she had believed with complete confidence that she understood the exact nature of the transaction she was entering. A business arrangement, a practical solution. Two sensible adults managing a difficult situation with clear eyes and explicit terms. She had been wrong about at least one of them. The question she could not stop turning over was whether wrong was the word for it. What? On the fourth morning after finding the box, she made a decision. Not about what to do. She was nowhere near that. But a decision about how to conduct herself in the meantime, which was the kind of decision she was actually capable of making right now. She would watch him. Not suspiciously, not with the angled, testing quality of someone looking for a lie. She would simply pay attention, the way you paid attention to land you were learning, carefully, without assumption, letting the thing reveal itself in its own time. She had not been paying attention to Daniel Hart. She realized that now. She had been managing him, the way you managed a new employee, keeping him in the right box, assigning him to the right tasks, maintaining the appropriate distance. She had done it deliberately, because anything more than management felt dangerous, and she had been too depleted by grief and debt and survival to risk dangerous. But she had not actually been looking at him. She started looking. It was disorienting, at first, because looking meant noticing things she had been successfully not noticing, and not all of them were comfortable. She noticed that he always did his heaviest physical work in the morning, when he was freshest, and saved the lighter tasks, repairs, adjustments, minor maintenance, for the afternoon. This was not inefficiency. It was the work pattern of a man who understood how to manage his own endurance over a long season, who had learned through years of physical labor how to make his strength last. It was the habit of someone who had been doing this kind of work alone for a very long time. She noticed that he was reading through her father's papers, not privately. He had told her when he started, standing in the doorway of the small office off the parlor, asking with the same careful formality he brought to everything if she minded. "I'd like to understand the full picture of the operation," he had said, "the past several years of records, if they're available." She had told him the records were in the bottom drawer of the oak desk, and he had thanked her and closed the door quietly, and she had told herself it was practical. He was a partner in the operation. Of course, he should understand the records. Now she understood he had probably spent 20 years wanting to understand those records. Not for the numbers, for the life they described. She noticed the way he moved through the property. Not like a man settling into new territory, but like a man returning to a place he had been carrying in his mind for a long time. He paused sometimes, at no particular moment of obvious significance, and looked out at the land with an expression she could only have described to herself privately as recognition. Not surprise, not the particular pleasure of a man seeing a beautiful thing for the first time. Something quieter and older than that. She noticed the way he spoke about her father. He did it rarely. He was not a man who spoke much about anything, but when the occasion arose, when some task brought up a memory or a comparison, he referred to Thomas Carter with a respect that was not performative, not the practice morning of a man managing her feelings, something that had its own specific texture, its own weight, the respect of a person for someone who had shaped them in ways they were still accounting for. "Your father built the drainage on the East Field differently from most," he said one afternoon, when they were both looking at the problem of where the overflow had been going. "He ran it under the fence line instead of around it. Takes more digging initially, but it holds better in a heavy thaw." "How do you know how he built it?" she asked. There was a brief pause, the kind she had started noticing, the half-second between a question and his answer when something moved across his face and then was carefully replaced with steadiness. "I worked a lot of different operations," he said. "You start to notice which approaches hold and which ones don't." He turned back to the drainage problem. She watched the back of his head and thought, "You know because you were here when he built it." She said nothing. The thing about living in close proximity to someone and trying to figure out who they are is that the ordinary moments do more of the work than the significant ones. It is not in the dramatic instances that a person reveals themselves. It is in the way they handle the small indignities and inconveniences of daily life. The cold breakfast, the equipment that breaks at the wrong moment, the animal that won't cooperate, the long stretch of gray afternoon when nothing is going well and there is still a great deal left to do. Daniel Hart, under ordinary pressure, did not flinch. There was a morning, 10 days or so after the barn, when the stove in the kitchen refused to draw properly and filled the room with smoke. Evelyn had been fighting it for 20 minutes, coughing and swearing under her breath. She swore under her breath when she was alone, a habit she had developed during her father's long illness when she needed somewhere to put her frustration that wasn't at him. When Daniel appeared in the doorway, he assessed the situation without asking what had happened. He checked the flue, found the blockage, a section of creosote buildup that had loosened and partially collapsed, and spent the next 2 hours clearing it in the cold, working methodically from the roof down while she handed up tools and tried to keep the smoke from the kitchen from spreading through the rest of the house. "You could have left it for today," she said, when he came down off the roof the second time. "You need the stove," he said. "It's not an emergency." "But you've been cooking on that stove twice a day since I got here," he said, and there was something almost careful in the way he said it, like a man navigating close to something he had decided not to say. "You need it working properly." She looked at him for a moment, his face darkened with creosote dust, the cold air making his breath visible in small, quick clouds. "You're going to be cleaning yourself up until supper time," she said. "I've been dirtier," he said simply, and went back up the ladder. She stood in the yard holding a chimney brush and thought about a 12-year-old boy on a ranch in the summer, doing whatever work needed doing with the same bottomless and undemonstrative competence, and felt the shape of the thing she was still trying not to name move a little closer. There was a different afternoon when one of the younger horses, a 3-year-old gray she had raised from a foal and who was still not entirely trustworthy under pressure, spooked badly in the yard and pulled free of her hand, taking off across the north pasture with the kind of panicked speed that meant catching him before the fence would be a serious undertaking. She had started after him at a run, because that was what you did, and Daniel had been coming around the corner of the barn with a load of posts, and he dropped them without a word and moved past her at a pace she couldn't match, not running exactly, but covering ground with an efficiency that was startling. She watched him close the distance to the horse with a patience that seemed impossible given the speed of the animal. Not chasing, exactly, but angling, working the horse's own movement against it in a way that required an extremely detailed understanding of how frightened horses think. He brought the gray around and back in about 15 minutes, walking him in slow circles until his breathing settled, talking to him the whole time in a voice too low for Evelyn to make out the words from where she stood at the fence. "He's all right," he said when he brought the horse back to her. "Spooked at a hawk, I think. There's been one working that pasture." "I know about the hawk," she said. "I know you do." He handed her the lead rope. "You might want to work him in the round pen for a few days. Get his feet under him again before you put him in open pasture." "I was planning to," she said. "I figured," he said, and walked back to his fence posts. She stood with the gray's nose against her shoulder, feeling his warm breath against her neck, and watched Daniel Hart pick up the posts he had dropped and carry on as if nothing had happened, and thought, "Who are you?" Not as an accusation, not even as a question exactly, more as a wonder. She went back to the barn 3 days before she let herself admit she had been going back. She told herself the first time that she was checking the grain bins again. She had noticed some irregularity in the seams of the second bin that might indicate moisture getting in. She checked the bins. They were fine. She stood in the middle of the barn floor for a long moment, and then she crouched down, worked her fingers under the loose board, and took out the tin box. She read the letters again, all 15. This time she read them differently. The first time she had read them as documents, as evidence of a fact she was trying to establish. This time she read them as something else, as the record of a person, as the long unwitnessed account of someone moving through the world carrying something they had decided, for complicated and privately considered reasons, they had no right to put down. The 5th letter was the one she kept returning to. "There is a particular problem with caring about something at a distance for a long time," he had written. He would have been 17. "You start to confuse the person you care about with the version of them you carry in your head. The real person keeps getting older and more themselves and further from whatever you imagined, and the version in your head stays the same. And eventually, you have to make a decision about which one you're actually attached to. I don't know the answer to that yet. I think maybe you never know, and you just have to keep choosing." She read that paragraph 4 times. She thought about what it meant to be 17 years old and understand something that most people never got around to, and to write it down in a letter you were never going to send, To a girl who had handed you water once and smiled without meaning anything by it. She thought about the shape of that kind of loneliness. She thought about the shape of the life built around it. Not in bitterness, not in resentment, but with the steady hands of a person who had decided that longing was simply a condition of their existence, like the weather, and the only dignified response was to work anyway. She put the letters back. She replaced the board. She stood in the barn for a long time. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening, in the kitchen, over a repair that had nothing to do with any of this. Evelyn had been replacing the leather washer and the pump handle for most of the afternoon, a small job that had become irritating due to a seized bolt she couldn't get to cooperate. And she was still at it after dark, crouched on the kitchen floor with a wrench and a vocabulary of quiet curses, when Daniel came in from the evening check on the livestock. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the situation and said, "Do you want a hand with that?" "I want this bolt to do what it's supposed to do," she said. "Can I try?" She moved back. He sat down on the floor, which struck her oddly. The ease with which he simply sat on the kitchen floor, no performance of it, and looked at the bolt for a moment, then reached past her for a different tool from the small collection she had spread on the floor, applied it at a slightly different angle, and the bolt turned. "There's a specific angle on that fitting," he said. "I noticed it when I was checking the pump last week. The threading's worn down on one side." She stared at him. "You knew about the bolt?" "I was going to mention it," he said. "It kept slipping my mind." "That would have saved me 2 hours," she said. He had the grace to look genuinely apologetic. "You're right. I should have said something. I'm sorry." She sat back on her heels and looked at him, sitting on her kitchen floor with the wrench in his hand, and something that had been building without her permission for the past 2 weeks pushed against the surface, and she heard herself say, before she had made any decision to say it, "Did you work here?" The words landed flat and precise in the quiet kitchen. He went still. Not the flinch of a man caught in a lie. There was no scramble, no deflection, no careful repositioning of his expression. He went still the way still water goes still, complete and deep and reflecting. He set the wrench down on the floor between them. He looked at it for a moment. "Yes," he said. The single syllable held the weight of 15 years. She did not move. "How old were you?" 12. A pause. "The summer of 68. 2 months, maybe a little more. Your father hired me on through the season." "I was 11, she said. "I know," he said. "You brought water at noon." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove made its low, even sounds. Outside, the wind had died down for once, and the silence of the property was absolute. "Daniel," she said, and something in the way she said his name, perhaps the fact that she had never quite said it that way before, without it being the preface to some functional request, made him finally look at her. His face in the lamplight was open in a way she had not seen it before. Not exposed, not afraid. Open. The way a door is open, not revealing everything inside, but making it possible to enter. "There's a tin box," she said, "under the floor in the barn." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I know. I found it." "I know," he said again. 3 weeks ago. You were in the barn for a long time in the evening, and when you came back in, you were different. I've been waiting for you to say something." The honesty of that, the simple, undefended honesty of it, cut through something in her that had been held very tightly for a very long time. "You knew I found it," she said, "and you didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to bring up," he said. "I put those letters there a long time ago. I didn't put them there for you to find. If you found them and decided not to say anything, that was your right." "Those letters are about me," she said, and her voice came out with an edge she hadn't quite intended. "I know that," he said. "And I know what it means that you read them, and I know it wasn't fair to you. None of this was fair to you." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "When I came here to make my offer, I told you it was practical. That was true. It was practical. Every word I said to you that day was true. But not all of it," she said. "No," he said. "Not all of it." The lamp between them flickered slightly in a draft she couldn't locate. His face, in the unsteady light, looked exactly like what it was. A man who had carried something for a very long time and had just set it down and was not entirely sure, now that his hands were empty, what to do with them. "Why didn't you just tell me," she said, "when you came here? Why didn't you say, 'I was here before, I knew your father, I've thought about this land for 15 years. He was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said carefully, "if I had told you that, you would have thought I was trying to use it to persuade you. You would have thought I was trading on something, on your grief, on your father's memory. You would have been right to think that." He met her eyes steadily. "You needed to make the decision without the weight of it. It needed to be a practical offer for a practical problem. You needed to be able to say yes or no based on the terms, not based on what you felt about any of the rest of it." Evelyn stared at him. "That is," she said slowly, "either the most considerate thing anyone has ever done for me, or the most calculated." "Possibly both," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, which surprised her. "You sat in this house for 3 weeks," she said, "knowing that I had found those letters, knowing that I was sitting across this table from you every day, figuring out who you were, and you just waited," he said. "Waited. It seemed like the only respectful thing to do." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire snapped. The lamp steadied. "Who taught you to be patient like that?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was something else. Genuine, slightly wondering. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "Nobody," he said. "I just learned that wanting something loudly doesn't make it happen any faster, and it makes you harder to be around in the meantime." She sat with that for a moment. "I need you to understand something," she said. "What I agreed to when I married you, the terms I laid out, those were real. Those are still real. I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "I don't know what to do with any of this yet. With what I read, with what you just told me. I need time to understand it." "I know," he said. "And I need you to stop waiting for me to catch up," she said, with more force than she intended. "I need you to stop being so—" She searched for the word. "Patient. It's unsettling." He looked at her, and something moved through his expression that she thought, impossibly, might have been the beginning of a real smile. Not a performance of one, not a polite one, but the kind that starts somewhere behind a person's eyes. "I'll try," he said. "You won't," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been doing carefully for the past 2 weeks, but not in front of him. And she thought about a 12-year-old boy on this land, and a 17-year-old riding in a barn, and a man riding back through this valley every few years to look at a gate from the road, and a different man arriving on the stage from the east with his horse already stabled, having already done the arithmetic, already knowing what he was willing to offer and asking nothing back. She thought about 15 years of silence, 15 years of keeping your own feeling in a box underground where it wouldn't cause anyone any inconvenience. She thought about what it cost a person to be that careful, for that long, alone. And she felt something in the place below her sternum. Not love, she was not calling it that. She was not ready to call it anything at all. But something that was the shape of what might become something, in its own time, if she let it. She stood up. She brushed her skirt off. She picked up the wrench and the leather washer and set them on the table. "Finish the pump," she said. He looked up at her. "Please," she added. He picked up the wrench. She put the kettle on. They did not speak again that evening, but the silence between them was different from all the silences that had come before it. It had something in it now. Not resolution. Nothing had been resolved. Not comfort. Not exactly. But the particular quality of a silence between two people who have, for the first time, said the true thing to each other and are now existing in the same room with the truth between them. It was not a small thing. Evelyn stood at the stove and listened to the sounds of the pump being put back together. The click of the washer seating properly, the thread of the bolt catching clean, the slow squeak of the handle being tested, and felt the ground beneath her, which had been uncertain for longer than she could account for, come just slightly, provisionally, into something like steadiness. Not solid, not safe. but something. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at his end of the table without being asked. He came to the table when the pump was done. He picked up the cup. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, silently, without announcement, the way the most significant things always arrived in Red Hollow. It came down in slow, unhurried flakes, covering the yard and the fence line and the roof of the old barn, settling over the tin box and the 15 years inside it, and the distance between two people that was finally, carefully, beginning to close. The snow stayed, came down through the night and into the following morning, covering the valley in the particular silence that only heavy snow produces, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier than sound, something that muffles and softens and makes the world feel both smaller and more complete at the same time. By the time Evelyn woke, the yard was 8 inches deep and still accumulating, and the mountains to the northwest had disappeared entirely behind a gray wall of moving weather. She lay in her father's bed for a few minutes longer than usual, listening to the house. She could hear Daniel already up, the sound of the back door, the particular rhythm of his boots on the frozen porch steps, the creak of the barn door on its iron hinges. Early. Always early. She had noticed in the weeks since he arrived that he slept less than she did, or at least rose earlier, and she had never heard him complain about fatigue the way most men did. He absorbed work the way dry ground absorbed water, completely, without show, until you looked back and realized how much had gone in. She dressed and went to the kitchen and found that he had already stoked the stove before going out. The room was warm, the coffee was on. She stood at the window with her cup and looked out at the snow-covered yard and thought about the night before with the particular, slightly stunned quality of a person accounting for the distance they had traveled without fully deciding to travel it. She had not planned to say anything. She had not planned to sit on the kitchen floor and ask him point blank whether he had worked on her father's land. It had simply come out of her, the way things came out when the pressure behind them had been building long enough. And he had said yes. Quietly, completely, without negotiation or apology. Yes, she turned the word over in her mind while she drank her coffee and the snow came down outside, and Daniel moved through the barn doing morning chores with his usual unhurried efficiency. And she tried to decide what she was going to do with a yes that had 15 years attached to it and no instruction manual whatsoever. The snow trapped them together for 4 days. Not completely. The roads remained passable for a man on horseback, and Daniel made a trip into Red Hollow on the second day for supplies, returning with flour and salt and a bundle of newspapers that were 2 weeks old and therefore more or less current by Red Hollow standards. But the heavy work of the ranch contracted inward during a significant snowfall the way all life did in winter. Less outward movement, more attention to the small and immediate, more hours spent indoors in proximity to whoever shared your walls. Evelyn had been managing proximity carefully since the wedding. She had built a structure of polite distance that was so well constructed it had almost felt natural, like furniture you stop noticing because it has always been in the same place. But the night of the kitchen conversation had shifted something in that structure, loosened it at the joints, and now she found the distance harder to maintain. Not because Daniel was pressing on it, but because she was. She kept noticing him. She kept finding her eyes drawn across whatever room they occupied to wherever he was, drawn there the way your eyes are always drawn to the only source of movement in a still landscape, and then looking away quickly, the way you do when you have been caught at something you did not intend. He, for his part, behaved almost exactly as he had before. Almost. There was a change so small she might have imagined it, a marginal loosening in his own carefully maintained formality. The way a rope that has been held at constant tension for a very long time might relax a single degree when the hand holding it shifts its grip. He did not push. He had never pushed. But the quality of his restraint seemed different now, less like a man who did not want to move and more like a man who was choosing not to, very deliberately, one moment at a time. The conversations that happened during those 4 snowed-in days were different from the ones that had come before. Not dramatically. There was no sudden flood of confidence or revelation. But where their previous exchanges had been almost entirely functional, organized around tasks and logistics and the management of the property, these ones had seams in them, small openings through which something other than information moved. On the second day, she asked him about Colorado. She had remembered it from one of the letters, a mining operation he had worked for 2 years, long enough to buy a small stake, which he had subsequently lost in circumstances the letter did not fully explain. "What happened?" she asked. "With the mine." He was sitting at the kitchen table with the old newspapers spread out, reading with the focused stillness of a man who took information seriously. He looked up at her question and was quiet for a moment. "The company that owned the main shaft defaulted on its debts," he said. "The equipment creditors came in and took everything. The independent stakers got a fraction of what they'd put in. Some got nothing." "That was your savings?" "Most of it," he said. 2 years' worth." "What did you do?" He considered that. "I went to Kansas," he said. "There was freight work available. I needed to start over, and starting over always seems to go better when you move somewhere with less to remind you of what you lost." She thought about the letter where he had described this, not the loss itself, but the flatness of the Kansas landscape that had struck him as oddly comforting, the way a blank page could feel like possibility after a page that had been written wrong. "Were you angry?" she asked. "About the mine." "For a while," he said. "Then I realized being angry at a situation doesn't change the situation. It just makes you worse company while you're in it." "That sounds like something my father would have said," she said, without thinking. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decode. "He used to say something like that," he said. "Maybe not those exact words, but close." There it was again, the small, almost accidental opening, the reminder that he had known her father when she had not, had worked beside him and learned from him during a summer that Evelyn had been present for and had no memory of. Because at 11 years old, you do not pay attention to ranch hands, and you certainly do not consider that one of them might be building a permanent piece of furniture in his interior life out of the weeks he spent on your land. "Tell me something about him," she said, surprising herself. "From that summer, something I don't know." Daniel set the newspaper down. He looked at her steadily for a moment, as if gauging whether she truly wanted this, or whether she was testing him, or whether she was simply making conversation and would be satisfied with something small. He seemed to conclude that she meant it. "He used to do a thing in the evening," Daniel said, "after supper, when the work was done. He would walk the fence line on the south side of the property. Just that one section, every night, even when it didn't need checking. He'd walk it slowly, looking at the mountains. I watched him do it for the whole 2 months I was here. I never saw him miss a night, not even in bad weather." Evelyn felt something tighten briefly in her throat. "I know that," she said. "I used to go with him sometimes." "I know," he said. "I saw you once. You were walking alongside him, and you were about as tall as his elbow, and you were talking the whole time, and he was just listening. He had this expression—" He stopped. "What expression?" she said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something. "Like a man looking at something he built," he said finally. "Something he was proud of, not possessive, just glad it existed." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked down at her hands on the table. She turned her cup a quarter turn. She breathed. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was only slightly uneven. "You asked," he said simply, not dismissively, just acknowledging that she had asked, and he had answered, and that was a normal exchange between two people. She looked at him. His face was as composed as always, but there was something in his eyes, that color she still couldn't resolve, in the winter light that was gray and blue at once, that was present in a way she had not allowed herself to look at directly before. He was watching her with the full weight of his attention, which, she was beginning to understand, was a different thing from being watched. Most people looked at you and were simultaneously planning what to say next, or managing how they were being perceived or half elsewhere in their own concerns. Daniel Hart looked at you and was simply there, completely. Like weather, not asking anything of you, not performing for you, just present in a way that had no agenda and required no response. It was, she thought, and this surprised her enough that she looked away quickly, one of the most unsettling and one of the most restful things she had ever experienced. On the third day of the snow, she went back to the barn. She did not go for the letters this time. She went because the livestock needed tending, and the boy they occasionally hired for heavy work had not been able to get through the snow from his family's place, and there was simply too much to do with two pairs of hands, let alone one. Daniel was already there when she arrived, working through the stalls with his usual systematic thoroughness, and they fell into a working rhythm that she had noticed developing over the past several weeks. A wordless coordination, like two people who have done the same job in the same space long enough to stop requiring instructions. She was forking hay into the last stall when she stepped, without intending to, directly onto the loose floorboard. It did not give way under her. It just flexed slightly, that familiar slight rise and give of a board over an empty space, and she felt it through the sole of her boot and went still for a brief moment that she hoped was not visible. It was visible. "Evelyn," Daniel said from 2 stalls down. "I'm fine," she said. She kept moving. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I should have pulled those boards up the first week I was here. Reseated the joists. They're soft in the middle section." "The whole south wall needs reflooring," she said. "My father kept putting it off." "I'll do it this week, if the snow lets up enough." "All right," she said. They worked in silence for a few minutes. The horses moved in their stalls, their warm breath visible in the cold air. "Daniel," she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the hay. "Yes," he said, "in the letters." She stopped, started again. "The 5th one. You wrote something about the difference between the person you know and the person you imagine, when you care about someone at a distance." She heard him go still. The sounds of work stopped. "I remember it," he said. "You wrote that you have to keep choosing," she said, "between the real person and the version in your head, that you never really know which one you're attached to." "I wrote that at 17, he said. "I know." She turned to look at him finally. He was standing in the open space between the stalls, the pitchfork held at rest, looking at her with that full, undemanding attention. "Do you still think that?" He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything that mattered. "I think," he said slowly, "that when you're young, the distance makes the problem worse. When someone is very far away from you, and you can only imagine them, the imagined version starts to fill in for the real one, and you lose track of the difference." He paused. "But I also think there's a version of knowing someone that happens at a distance that isn't entirely false. You can know that a person is good, or capable, or worth knowing from a long way off. You can be right about the essential things. And wrong about the details," she said. "Yes," he said, "very wrong about the details." "Which details are you wrong about?" she asked. She wasn't sure why she was pushing. She only knew it felt necessary. He looked at her for a long moment. "I thought you were patient," he said. "I was wrong about that. You are determined, which is different. Patience is comfortable with waiting. Determination wears waiting like a coat that doesn't fit. Functional, but not easy." He paused. "I thought you were self-sufficient. I was wrong about that too. You are capable, which is also different. Capable people can use help. They just have to trust the person offering it." She stared at him. "That's a very precise set of corrections." "I've had a month to observe," he said. "What else?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you would be easier to read," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, something that was not quite amusement but was close to it, and aimed gently at himself, that made her almost smile. "I'm not complicated," she said. "I'm just private." "I know that now," he said. "It's the same quality, from the outside." She looked at him standing in the barn that had held his letters for 15 years, on the land he had circled from a distance for longer than she had been dealing with loss, and thought about being seen. About the particular discomfort of being observed by someone who had been studying you from a long way off, not with any possessiveness, not with the quality of acquisition, but with the quality of someone who had decided long ago that you were worth the careful attention and had never revised the conclusion. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me honestly, not kindly, not diplomatically, honestly." "All right," he said. "If my father had not died," she said, "if there had been no debt, if the ranch had been fine and the bank had been paid and there had been no crisis, would you have come back? Would you have knocked on the door and told me any of this?" The barn was very quiet. He looked at her, and she watched him consider the question in all its honest dimensions, not reaching for comfort or evasion, just sitting with it the way he sat with everything. "No," he said. The word was stark and plain, and she felt it land solidly. "No," he said again, more quietly. "I would have come back to the valley because I always came back to the valley. I would have ridden past the gate and looked at the land and turned around and gone back to wherever I was living. I would have done that until I couldn't anymore, which probably would have been a long time." He paused. "I didn't have a plan that involved knocking on the door. I didn't think I had the right." "But you came when there was a reason," she said, "when you could make it useful." "Yes," he said, "because then it wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what you needed. That made it something I was allowed to do." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. There was something about the logic of that, the specific, quietly devastating logic of it, that she did not know how to argue with. A man who had carried a feeling for 15 years and determined privately that having the feeling did not give him the right to act on it. A man who had turned up only when he could offer something concrete, something real, something that removed the feeling from the equation and made the offer about her problem rather than his sentiment. She thought about how many men she had known in her life who operated on any principle remotely resembling that one. She could not produce a number. "That is," she said carefully, "either the most selfless thing I have ever heard or the saddest." "Possibly both," he said, in a faint echo of the kitchen conversation 2 nights before. And this time, the almost smile on his face was real enough that she could not mistake it. She did not smile back. She was not ready to smile back. But she felt something shift again, Mate. Something deep and structural, like a stone moving in a riverbed, changing the direction of the current above it by an almost imperceptible degree. "I need more time," she said. "I know," he said. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true," he said. She turned back to her work. He turned back to his. The horses settled in their stalls. The snow went on falling outside, slow and indifferent to the complicated things happening inside, burying the yard and the fence line and the floorboard beneath which there was nothing now but cold earth and empty space. The full confrontation, the one Evelyn had been both approaching and avoiding for weeks, came on the morning of the 23rd day of their marriage, and it came not because she had planned it, but because the accumulated weight of the unanswered thing had finally reached a threshold she could not carry past. She had been awake since before 4, lying in the dark, listening to the wind that had come up in the night, feeling the cold press of it against the window above the bed. She had been thinking, turning things over the way she did when her mind refused to rest, about the full shape of the situation. Not just the letters, not just Daniel's confession in the kitchen, not just the 4 days of careful new conversation during the snow, the whole shape. She had made a bargain. She had walked into that bargain believing she understood its terms completely, believing that she had accounted for all the variables, that she knew what she was trading and what she was receiving and what she was keeping separate. She had been wrong in a way that did not invalidate the bargain, but completely changed what the bargain meant. The question she had not yet been able to answer, the one that had been sitting in the center of everything like a stone she kept walking around, was what she felt about Daniel Hart. Not who he was to her historically, not what he had done or why, or what it cost him. What she felt, what was actually happening in the place below her sternum when she heard his boots on the porch steps, or when he said something precise and observant about her father, or when she walked into the kitchen and found the stove already warm. She was afraid of the answer, not because it was bad, because it was not. She lay in the dark and forced herself to sit with that fear long enough to understand its shape, and then she got up and dressed in the cold and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and waited. He came in from the morning check on the livestock at 5:30, the way he always did. He removed his coat at the door. He moved to the wash basin. He was almost to the table when he registered her sitting there at the wrong hour, and he stopped. "Is something wrong?" he said. Old instinct, old watchfulness. Something wrong meant livestock, weather, emergency. She could see him running through the list. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She placed the tin box on the table between them. She had gone to the barn before 4. She had taken the box from its place without ceremony, without standing over it or holding it against her chest this time. She had simply picked it up and carried it to the house, because it was time to stop keeping it underground. Daniel looked at the box on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time. His face, in the early morning lamplight, was the most open she had seen it. No particular effort at composure, no management of expression. Just a man looking at 15 years, and whatever it meant to have them placed on a table by the person they were written for. "I want you to tell me everything," Evelyn said. "Not the version you've already told me, the full version. I want to know about the summer you worked here. I want to know about the years between. I want to know why you kept writing letters you never sent instead of anything else. I want to know who you were and how you got to be who you are and what you actually thought you were going to do when you got on that stage and came back here." She stopped. "And I want you to stop being careful with me while you tell it." He looked at her. "I've been careful with you because you asked me to be," he said. "Those were your terms." "I'm changing one of them," she said. "I want the truth, straight, without diplomacy." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not be able to do it, might be too accustomed to the management of himself, too practiced at the particular art of holding things at a specific measured distance. But then he put his hands flat on the table, both of them, side by side, a gesture that looked almost like a man steadying himself against a surface before saying something irreversible, and he started talking. He told her about the summer he was 12. He told it without sentiment, but completely. The circumstances that had brought him to her father's ranch, which were not circumstances anyone would choose. A mother who had died the previous winter, a father who was alive but absent in every way that mattered. A series of half arrangements with distant relatives that had eventually deposited him in the Wyoming territory with nothing but the capacity for physical work and the need to eat. Thomas Carter had hired him for 2 months and fed him and treated him with a straightforward human decency that Daniel described plainly, without dramatization, as something he had not encountered much before that point. It was enough that it left a mark. "He didn't treat you like a charity case," Evelyn said. She knew her father well enough to hear this. "He treated me like a worker who had done his job," Daniel said, "which was the best thing he could have given me." He told her about leaving, not dramatically, not with any particular farewell. "You left when the season ended." That was the arrangement. He had packed his 2 items on a September morning and walked out the gate, and that should have been the end of it. "But it wasn't," she said. "But it wasn't," he agreed. "I kept thinking about the place. I couldn't explain it better than that at the time. I just kept thinking about it. The way the light came off the mountains in the afternoon. The way your father talked about the land like it was a thing worth taking care of. And you." He said the last 2 words without particular weight. The way you say a thing when you have stopped needing to manage how it lands. "You were 11 years old, and you brought out the water and said, 'Very seriously, Father says you've been doing good work,' and then you went back inside, and I think I knew right then that I had a problem." Despite everything, despite the tightness in her chest and the weight of the tin box between them, Evelyn felt the corner of her mouth move. "I was 11, she said. "I was repeating what my father said." "I know that," he said. "I knew that even then. It didn't help." He told her about the letters, why he had started writing them, which was exactly what the first letter said. Because there was no other place to put the thought. Because he was 12 and had no one to talk to, and the feeling was too large to carry silently. And then he had kept writing, not because he expected anything from it, but because putting things down on paper was the only way he knew to process the years accumulating between him and the person he'd left them with. "Why did you leave them in the barn?" she asked. "You came back through the valley. You could have taken them." "I could have," he said. "I kept thinking I would. And then I wouldn't. I don't know how to explain this exactly." He looked at his hands. It felt like they belonged there, in that place. They were part of what that summer meant to me. And that summer was part of this land. And if I took them, I would be taking something away from the only place they made sense. Evelyn looked at him. "Or you would have had to stop," she said quietly. He looked up at her. "If you took the letters," she said, "you'd have had to stop writing them. Or start writing them to yourself, which would have made it too obvious what you were doing. But as long as they were here, you had a reason to keep coming back. A place to put the years. He was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said. Probably that too. The room was very still. Daniel, she said, tell me what you thought when you made the offer. The real version, not the practical one. He looked at her directly. He had been working up to this, she could tell. Or rather, she could see him choosing to stop working up to it, choosing to simply say the thing. I thought, he said, that I had one chance, one occasion when I could do something real and concrete that would help you, not help some idea of you, not help a girl I'd invented in 15 years of letters, but help you specifically, the actual person with the actual problem. And I thought if I could do that, if I could show up and be useful and not make it about anything other than what you needed, then maybe I'd deserve to be in the same room with you. Not more than that, just in the same room. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Evelyn looked at the tin box between them. She thought about 15 years. She thought about a man who had decided that usefulness was the highest form of love he had any right to offer. She thought about her own terms, separate rooms, no pretending, a practical arrangement, and nothing more. And she thought about how those terms had been built on an understanding of the situation that was not wrong exactly, but was incomplete in a way that changed everything. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his, just for a moment, just briefly, the way you might touch something you are not yet sure you are allowed to hold. His hand went completely still beneath hers, the way a wild thing goes still when it is touched unexpectedly, not in fear but in a kind of total attention. She lifted her hand. I need to think, she said, about all of it. I know, he said. Stop saying that, she said. I'll try, he said. She pushed her chair back. She stood. She looked at the tin box on the table and at the man sitting behind it. This man she had married for practical reasons. This man who had carried her name in a box under a floorboard for 15 years. This man who had done the most extraordinary and quietly devastating thing she had ever witnessed, decided that wanting something did not grant you the right to have it, and behaved accordingly for longer than most people could have managed it. She picked up the tin box. She walked down the hall to her father's room, her room now, and she set it on the windowsill, in the morning light, where it would not be underground anymore. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked out the window, at the snow-covered land, her father's land, the land this man had circled for 15 years, and finally, at enormous and uncalculated personal cost, chosen to stand on. The mountains were visible this morning, for the first time in days, cold and clear and enormous against the pale sky, their white peaks catching the early light and throwing it back with a brightness that had no patience for anything complicated, anything held back, anything still hiding in the dark under floorboards. Evelyn stood at the window and breathed. The ground beneath her was still shifting. She could feel it. The shape of things was still changing, still becoming something she did not have a full name for. But for the first time since she had signed her name next to a stranger's on a gray November morning and told herself it meant nothing more than it said, she let herself admit, privately, completely, without qualification, that it might mean something more, that she might want it to, that the wanting, which she had been managing so carefully for so many weeks, was not going to stay managed forever, and that this might not, in the end, be a thing to be afraid of. Outside, the sun climbed over the eastern ridge, and the snow on the yard went bright and brilliant, and the whole white world threw the light back at the sky. And Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Hart, stood at the window of her father's house and held the truth of the situation in both hands for the very first time. It was heavier than she expected, and lighter, both at once. The tin box sat on the windowsill for 3 days before Evelyn moved it. She was not sure why she left it there, whether it was a kind of test she was running on herself, or simply that she could not decide what its permanent place should be now that it had been brought out of the ground. It sat in the morning light and the afternoon light and the thin gray light of overcast evenings, a small rusted object containing 15 years of carefully folded paper, and every time she passed the window she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a sound that is just below the threshold of hearing. Not intrusive, just present, a constant low note running beneath everything else. The days that followed the morning of the full confession had a different texture from anything that had come before. Something had been said that could not be unsaid, And while that was not the same as something being resolved, it changed the atmosphere of the house in a way that was palpable and strange, like the air after a lightning strike, charged, clarified, carrying the smell of something that had burned. Daniel did not press her. He had promised to try not to be patient, and he was failing at that promise completely, but she found that she minded it less than she had expected to. His patience, she was beginning to understand, was not a weapon or a strategy. It was simply the form his respect took. He had decided long ago that her right to her own time and her own conclusions was not something he was willing to compromise, even when, perhaps especially when, his own preferences ran in a different direction. She found that more complicated to be angry at than she would have liked. She also found herself in those days doing something she had not done in a long time. She found herself thinking about her father. Not the grief. The grief was always there, familiar as weather, something she had learned to carry the way you carry a thing you cannot put down. She was thinking about her father specifically in relation to Daniel, turning the two of them over in her mind together, running the thread that connected them through her fingers, trying to understand what it meant that the man who had shaped Daniel's early sense of what decency looked like was the same man who had shaped hers. Her father had been a quiet man, Thomas Carter. Not cold, never cold, but economical with his words in the way of men who had decided early that actions told a more reliable story. He had run the ranch with a simplicity of purpose that Evelyn had taken for granted until she was old enough to understand how rare it was. He paid what he owed. He kept his word. He worked as hard as he asked anyone else to work, and he never asked anyone to do a thing he wouldn't do himself. He had been kind to the people who worked for him, not because he was demonstrative about kindness, but because he believed, in the practical and untheoretical way he believed everything, that a person treated decently would work better and live better and be a better neighbor. And all of those things had practical value. She thought about a 12-year-old boy showing up at that ranch with nothing. She thought about what it would have meant in those circumstances to be treated like a worker who had done his job. She thought about the letter. He didn't treat me like a charity case. She sat with her father's ledger open on the table one afternoon and did not see the numbers. She was seeing instead a summer she had lived through without noticing, a summer that had been ordinary to her and had been, to someone else, the thing everything else was built on. The grief and the tenderness arrived together, the way they often did when she thought about her father now, and she let them sit there for a while without trying to separate them. On the fourth day, she moved the tin box to the shelf above the fireplace in the parlor, the same shelf where her father had kept the things that mattered to him. A small brass compass that had belonged to his own father. A photograph of her mother, taken the year before she died, slightly blurred the way all photographs were at the edges, but steady in the center where her face was. A river stone, smooth and gray, that Evelyn had given him when she was 7 and had told him, with great seriousness, was good luck. She put the tin box among those things and then stepped back and looked at it there. It felt right. She was not entirely sure what right meant in this context, but she recognized it the way you recognized it when you moved a piece of furniture to a new position after years in the wrong place. Not dramatic, not revelatory, just the quiet satisfaction of a thing finding where it belonged. Daniel saw her do it. He was in the doorway of the parlor when she stepped back, and she turned and found him there. He had the quality, when he was trying not to be noticed, of taking up less space than he actually occupied, a skill she suspected he had developed out of lifelong practice. And they looked at each other across the room for a moment. She waited for him to say something. He did not say anything. She walked past him into the kitchen. He followed, and they had their usual morning conversation about the work that needed doing, and neither of them mentioned the shelf. What neither of them knew in those carefully managed days of early December was that the situation was about to be complicated by something neither of them had planned for. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she had been Evelyn's closest friend since they were girls together in the one-room schoolhouse on the south side of Red Hollow. Ruth was a woman of considerable energy and very few filters, married to a rancher named Bert Calloway, who had the good sense and the good fortune to be genially tolerant of both qualities, and she had been away visiting her sister in Laramie for the 6 weeks that had encompassed the entirety of Evelyn's marriage, which meant she had missed the whole event and was arriving now to remedy that situation with characteristic force. She appeared at the gate on a Wednesday morning, driving her own buckboard with the confidence of a woman who considered horses a formality, and she had the wagon stopped and herself climbing down before Evelyn had fully registered what was happening. "Evelyn Marie Carter," Ruth said across the yard, in a voice designed to carry over weather. "You got married and did not tell me." "I wrote you a letter," Evelyn said. "You wrote me 3 sentences," Ruth said. "3 sentences, Evie, after 20 years of friendship. Dear Ruth, I have married a man named Daniel Hart to settle father's debt. The ranch is doing well. Hope Laramie is treating you kindly. That is not a letter. That is a telegram with punctuation." Evelyn sighed. She had known this was coming. She had been braced for it. She had not been braced for it quite this morning, but there was no point negotiating with Ruth Calloway's timing. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." Daniel was in the barn. He emerged about 20 minutes into Ruth's visit, called in from the cold by Evelyn on the basis that Ruth had already cataloged everything she could find about the domestic arrangements from her seat at the kitchen table, and would begin speculating loudly if she was left without new material for long. He came in, removed his hat, and stood in the kitchen doorway with a composure that Evelyn privately felt was admirable, given that Ruth Calloway's assessment process was about as subtle as a cattle drive through a parlor. "So you're the man," Ruth said. "Daniel Hart," he said. "You must be Ruth Calloway." "Evie mentioned me," Ruth said, sounding slightly mollified. "Several times," he said. "She says you're the best person in Red Hollow to know if you need to find out something you haven't been told directly." Ruth stared at him. Then she turned to Evelyn. "I like him," she announced. "You've known him for 30 seconds, Evelyn said. "I knew I liked Bert in 20, Ruth said. 30 is practically a long courtship." Daniel poured himself coffee, exchanged a few words with Ruth about the Calloway operation and the winter grazing situation in the North Pasture, and then excused himself with the same quiet efficiency he always deployed when he had accurately gauged that his presence was not required. He was out the back door before Ruth had finished watching him go. She turned to Evelyn with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and satisfaction. "Well," she said. "Don't," Evelyn said. "I haven't said anything." "You have said a great deal," Evelyn said. "With your face." Ruth wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and leaned forward across the table in the manner of a woman settling in for the real conversation. "Tell me," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." Evelyn looked at her. Ruth Calloway had been sitting across from her at various tables since they were 6 years old, and in all that time she had never once used the information Evelyn gave her in ways that caused damage. She was not a gentlewoman. She was frank to the point of bluntness and had opinions she volunteered freely, but she was trustworthy in the specific and valuable way of someone who understood the difference between knowing a thing and needing to say it. So Evelyn told her. Not everything, such not the letters, not the full history, but the outline of it. The debt, the offer, the courthouse, the terms, the weeks that had followed, the discovery in the barn, the conversation over the pump, the morning with the tin box on the table. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to demonstrate that she understood the gravity of what she was hearing. When Evelyn finished, there was a pause. "Let me understand this correctly," Ruth said. "He knew you as a child. He has been, by your account, quietly devoted to you for 15 years. He returned when you needed help, arranged his offer specifically so that it would not obligate you emotionally, married you on terms that give him nothing he didn't already give up willingly, and has spent the past month working your land and keeping his distance and waiting for you to decide what you think of him." "That's a very compressed version," Evelyn said. "That's the accurate version," Ruth said. "Evie, what is the problem?" Evelyn looked at her cup. "The problem is that I don't know if what I feel is real," she said, "or if I'm responding to the situation, the weight of it, the 15 years, the letters. It's a great deal to feel your way around, and I can't tell if I actually... She stopped. "If you actually feel something for him," Ruth said, "or if you feel something for the idea of being that important to someone." The accuracy of it landed precisely enough that Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." Ruth sat back. She considered this with genuine seriousness. "That's a fair question," she said, surprising Evelyn, who had expected more direct encouragement. "It's a real question. The two things feel alike from the inside, and they're very different on the outside. She tilted her head. What does he do that you couldn't have imagined? What? The version of him you would have invented, Ruth said, from the letters, from the history, from the romantic weight of the whole thing. What does the actual man do that doesn't match the version you'd have constructed? Evelyn thought about that. He's funny, she said after a moment. Not obviously, but occasionally he says something so precisely dry that you realize a full beat later that it was a joke, and by then he's already moved on. He doesn't wait for the laugh. Ruth smiled slightly. What else? He reads the same paragraph multiple times, Evelyn said, when he's at the newspapers or the records. I've watched him. He'll read something and then go back and read it again before he moves on. I asked him about it once, and he said he didn't trust a thing he'd only heard once. A pause. He treats information the way he treats everything else. He doesn't assume he understood it correctly the first time. What else? Ruth said. He talks to the horses, Evelyn said. Not the way some men do. Not the performative kind, not explaining himself to them because he wants an audience that won't argue back. He talks to them the way you talk to someone you respect who can't answer, like he's keeping them informed. She paused. My father used to do that. Ruth was watching her with an expression that was neither smug nor particularly soft, just attentive, just Ruth, which had always been enough. Evie, she said gently, I think you know the answer to your question. I'm not ready, Evelyn said. I understand that, Ruth said, but knowing and being ready are different things. You can know something true and not be ready to act on it. That doesn't make it less true. Evelyn looked at the window. Outside, she could see the barn. She could see, distantly, through the cold glass, the shape of Daniel moving across the yard with a load of something, heading toward the south pasture. The unhurried, efficient movement she had been watching for weeks. The gait of a man doing necessary work without drama, without expectation of applause. What if I get it wrong? She said. How would you get it wrong? Ruth asked. What if I let it become something and it doesn't hold? What if the terms change and I've given up the only control I have? She turned away from the window. What if I open a door and he turns out to be something different from what he's presented? And I've already what? Ruth said. Already let him matter, Evelyn said, quietly, with a precision that surprised even herself. Ruth did not say he already matters. You already let him. It's already done. She was wise enough not to. Instead, she reached across the table and put her hand over Evelyn's, briefly, the way Evelyn had put her hand over Daniel's a few mornings ago, just for a moment, just to acknowledge that the thing being said was real and heavy and deserved to be treated that way. There's no door you can open, Ruth said, that gives you a guarantee. You know that. You have always known that. The question is whether you'd rather be safe with the wrong version of your life or uncertain with the right one. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. That is extremely unhelpful advice, she said finally. It's the only honest advice, Ruth said. The rest of it is just comfort, and I don't think you want comfort right now. I think you want someone to tell you what to do, and I can't do that, and neither can anyone else. She paused. But I will tell you this. I've known you your entire life. I have watched you handle things that would have leveled most people, and I've watched you be stupid about things that were obvious to everyone around you. The stupid things were always the same thing. They were always the times you decided that wanting something was a good enough reason not to trust yourself. Evelyn looked at her. You thought wanting the ranch to survive was making you irrational about your father's decline, Ruth said. You spent 2 extra years managing instead of saying goodbye. She held Evelyn's gaze. Don't do that again. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn turned her cup in her hands. Once. Twice. He hasn't asked me for anything, she said. Not as a complaint, as an observation, precise and slightly wondering. In all of this, the letters, the confession, all the conversations, he has never once asked me for anything. Not even to reconsider the terms, not a word about the separate rooms. Nothing. I know, Ruth said. Most men? I know, Ruth said again, softer this time. Why doesn't he ask? Evelyn said, and there was something raw in the question. Not distress, but the genuine bewilderment of a person confronting a thing they do not have enough experience with to fully categorize. Ruth looked at her with a kind of careful gentleness. "Because he's already decided," she said, "that whatever you give him is enough. He's not managing his way toward a different outcome. He just means it, Evie. He means exactly what he said he meant. And I think you know that, and I think that is the most terrifying thing about him." Ruth stayed for the afternoon and left before dark, driving her buckboard back toward Red Hollow with the self-satisfied air of a woman who felt she had accomplished something which Evelyn supposed she had, in her own particular way. The yard was quiet after she left, the cold coming in hard from the northwest, and Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment listening to the sound of the buckboard wheels on the frozen road getting smaller and smaller until they were gone. The house felt very still. She went in and made supper, and when Daniel came in from the evening work, she put the plates on the table and sat down across from him, and they ate in the usual quiet. But the usual quiet was different now. Had been different since the morning of the tin box, since the kitchen floor and the pump and the 15 years conversation, and she was finished pretending not to notice. She set down her fork. "Ruth thinks I'm being an idiot," she said. He looked up. Something moved in his expression, something very close to amusement, quickly controlled. "She seems like someone who would say so," he said. "She didn't say it exactly," Evelyn said. "She was more diplomatic than usual, but that was the substance." He said nothing. He was waiting, in that way he waited, not passively, not vacantly, but with the full presence of a man who had decided that the next thing said should be said by someone else. "I need you to tell me something honestly," she said, "and I need you to tell me now, not carefully." "All right," he said. "Are you happy?" she said. "Not with the ranch, not with the arrangement, with here, this, the way things are, day to day. Are you happy?" He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him resist the first answer that came to him, the careful one, the managed one, and reach for the true one instead. "No," he said. "Not entirely." She had not expected that. "Why not?" she said. "Because I am living in close proximity to someone I care about," he said, the words coming out carefully but not evasively, like a man walking a path he is certain of, but watching his footing, under terms that were designed to maintain a distance that I agreed to and would agree to again because it was the right offer at the time. But the distance has become... He stopped. Started again. "It costs more than I expected," he said. "Now that I'm here. It cost less when I was riding past the gate." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The honesty of it. The plain, undefended honesty. "I didn't know how much I was asking," she said. "You asked for what you needed," he said. "That was right. I'm not..." He shook his head. "I'm not unhappy, Evelyn. I want to be clear about that. Waking up on this land every morning is something I spent a long time wanting. Working it is something I'm grateful for. Sitting at this table with you..." He stopped again. He looked down at his hands. "I'm the wrong person to ask about happiness," he said. "I have a high tolerance for not having things. I don't know how to accurately report on what it feels like to have them." She looked at him across the table, at this man who had built himself into someone capable and steady and deeply, quietly alone, at the 15 years in the box on the parlor shelf, at the space between them that was narrower than it had been and still wider than it needed to be. "I want to change one of the terms," she said. He went still. I'm not..." She pressed her hands flat on the table, feeling the solidity of it beneath her palms. "I'm not ready to change all of it. I need you to understand that. I need it to be slow. I need to do it on my own time and not feel rushed by it, or manage toward it, or..." "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "What's the term?" he said. She looked at him. "Supper," she said. "I want to talk at supper, not about the livestock or the fences or the weather. I want to know you, actually know you, the way I should have made some effort to know you before I agreed to share my property and my name with you." She paused. "That's the term." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face. Not the almost smile, not the controlled composure, but something more direct than either. Something that looked, if she was reading it accurately, like relief. "All right," he said. "Starting tonight," she said. He picked up his fork. "Then you should know," he said, with the precision dry quality she had described to Ruth, "that I have an opinion about the North Pasture rotation that I've been diplomatically withholding for 3 weeks. She stared at him. "That is not what I meant by getting to know you." "It tells you something about me," he said. "It tells me you have been holding back on the pasture rotation." "Among other things," he said. She picked up her own fork. "Fine," she said. "Tell me about the pasture rotation." He told her. And then she told him why she disagreed with half of it. And he listened to her disagreement with the full, serious attention he gave everything. And then he said she was right about the first part and stood by the second. And she argued the second. And somewhere in the middle of the argument, the quality of the evening shifted into something that was warm and present and entirely unlike obligation. Outside, the wind worked the eaves the way it always did, and the horses settled in the barn, and the mountain stood in the dark beyond the window, immovable and patient. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, the house did not feel like a place Evelyn was managing. It felt like a place she was in. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole difference. The weeks that followed were not simple. Evelyn had not expected simple, and she would not have trusted simple if it arrived. She had lived long enough in the frontier country to know that simple things were usually just complicated things that hadn't declared themselves yet. What they were instead was real. Incrementally, resistantly, with setbacks and silences and occasional moments where one or both of them retreated into old habits and had to find their way back, but real. The supper conversations became the center of something. An hour or two each evening where the work of the day was set aside and they sat across the table and said actual things to each other and listened to the actual things being said back. She learned that he had taught himself to read from a Bible someone left in a bunkhouse when he was 9, which was the only time in any of this that religion came anywhere near it. He had been fiercely self-educated after that, carrying books in his saddlebags on every cattle drive, borrowing from whatever lending libraries he could find in whatever towns he passed through, reading at night by firelight when the other men were playing cards or sleeping. She learned that he had, once, been close to marrying someone else. A woman in Kansas, a widow with 2 children and a sensible nature who had offered him something real and grounded. And he said this without drama, without self-congratulation, simply as a fact he owed her, said no. Not because of the letters under the floorboard, not because of Evelyn specifically, but because he had understood, sitting with the Kansas widow's sensible offer, that he was not capable of being fully present to it, and that she deserved someone who was. Evelyn sat with that for a long time after he said it. That was a generous thing to do, she said finally, for her. It was the honest thing, he said. Generous would have required more sacrifice. She learned that he was afraid of exactly one thing he would admit to, which was being a burden. Not financially. He had made his own way too long and too thoroughly to carry anxiety about money. But being a presence in someone's life that they had not fully chosen, that had imposed itself, that could not easily be removed. That was the fear underneath the patience, she understood now. That was what all the careful distance had been protecting against. Not his own heart, but the possibility of becoming someone else's obligation. She thought about what it meant to have spent your whole life being careful not to impose yourself on anyone, and then to have the person you most feared imposing upon show up at the bank's deadline and tell you the terms were fine. She thought about what it must have cost him. "You are not a burden," she said one evening, without preamble, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. The way you say a thing when you have been building to it for a while without noticing. He looked at her. "You haven't been a burden for one day," she said. "I want you to know that." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not required to say that," he said. "I'm aware of what I'm required to say," she said. "I'm telling you something else." He looked down at the table. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. It was, she noticed, exactly the gesture she made when she was managing something difficult. "Thank you," he said. Quietly, as if the 2 words had come from somewhere deep and were tired from the journey. She nodded. She looked at the fire in the stove. She breathed. She was still afraid. She did not think she was going to stop being afraid, but she was beginning to understand that the fear and the feeling were not opposites, were not in fact even separate things. They were the same thing, wearing different faces. You were afraid of losing what you valued. That was what fear was for. And the size of the fear was the accurate measure of the size of what you valued. By that accounting, Evelyn thought, sitting across the table from Daniel Hart in the warm kitchen of her father's house on a cold December evening, she was afraid of something quite large. She found she could live with that. She found, in fact, that she had already started to. The morning Daniel refloored the barn was the 14th of December. Evelyn knew the date because she had written it in the ledger the night before. Not for any particular reason, not because it was significant in any way she could have articulated at the time, but because she had been in the habit lately of noting things down with more precision than she used to. Small things. The first hard freeze of the season. The day the gray horse finally settled in open pasture without spooking. The evening Ruth came by unannounced and stayed for supper and talked to Daniel for 2 hours about irrigation methods while Evelyn sat at the end of the table and felt the peculiar, unguarded warmth of watching two people she valued decide they liked each other. She had been noting things down because she had started to feel, for the first time in a long time, that the days were worth recording. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were hers. She brought him coffee at mid-morning while he worked. This was new. She had not been in the habit of bringing coffee to the barn, had in fact been careful for weeks about the kinds of small gestures that might look like more than practicality. But the December cold was serious now, the kind that got into a person's hands and made fine work difficult, and he had been at the floorboard since before dawn, and she had found herself standing at the kitchen stove with 2 cups in her hands before she had made any conscious decision to be there. She stepped inside the barn and stopped. He had pulled up nearly all the bad boards along the south wall, exposing the cold earth beneath, and was working his way methodically through the replacement, measuring each board, cutting it clean, setting it with the precision of someone who understood that a floor you walked on every day was worth doing right the first time. The barn smelled of fresh-cut wood and cold air and the particular warm animal smell of horses in winter, and the light was coming through the high south window at the angle that had caught the edge of the loose board weeks ago and started all of this. She stood for a moment and looked at the space where the floorboard had been. The earth beneath was bare and ordinary, cold dark dirt, nothing more. She crossed the floor and held out the cup. He looked up from where he was crouching over a measurement, registered the cup, and took it with both hands in the automatic way of a person whose hands have gone cold enough that warmth is the first thing they reach for. "Thank you," he said. "How long until it's finished?" she asked. "This afternoon, if the boards cooperate." He straightened, looked at the remaining section. "The joists are solid, it's just the surface boards that went bad. Another hour of pulling up, couple more laying down, and it'll hold another 20 years. She looked at the open earth where the box had been. "Do you want to fill that in?" she said. Under where it was, he followed her gaze. He was quiet for a moment. "It's just earth," he said. "Nothing there to fill." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to ask." He looked at her with that steady attention. He understood what she was really asking, which was not about the earth at all, but about whether either of them needed a ceremony around the closing of that space, whether the empty ground where the box had lived for 15 years deserved some particular acknowledgement before the new boards went down over it. "I think," he said carefully, "that putting a solid floor over it is acknowledgement enough." She considered that. "That's very practical," she said. "It's also true," he said. She looked at the space one more time. She thought about 15 years going into the ground in a rusted tin box. She thought about this box on the parlor shelf, in the light, among the things that mattered. She thought about the difference between burying something and keeping it. "All right," she said. "I'll leave you to it." She was almost to the barn door when he said her name. She turned. He was still crouching over his work, but he had turned to look at her, and his expression had the quality she had come to recognize. The quality of a man who had decided to say the true thing and was in the process of not talking himself out of it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it straight." She waited. "The terms you set," he said, separate rooms, partnership, and nothing more. You said they were real, and still real. After everything... He stopped. Are they still what you want? The barn was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in a stall. The cold pressed at the walls. Evelyn looked at him across the open floor, across the exposed earth, across the distance she had built and maintained, and was now, she understood, standing at the edge of. No, she said. The word came out of her cleanly, without hesitation, without the careful management she had been applying to everything for months. Just the truth, arriving exactly on time. He looked at her. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not the way faces changed in theatrical moments. It was quieter than that. Something that had been held at a very specific tension for a very long time, released, slightly, and the result was a stillness that was different in quality from all the stillnesses that had come before it. Not the stillness of a man managing himself, the stillness of a man who had set something down. All right, he said. I still need it to be slow, she said. I need you to understand that. I can't promise you a destination. I can only tell you I want to keep moving. That's enough, he said. You always say that, she said. Because it keeps being true, he said. The echo of earlier conversations, the same words in a different register. Not resignation this time, but something that held genuine warmth at its center. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at him and thought, this is the moment. Not the dramatic one, not the one with the tin box on the table or the confession over the pump. This one. This quiet, cold, practical December morning with a man crouching over a freshly cut floorboard and her standing in the door with an empty coffee cup, saying the true thing without ceremony, because the ceremony had never been the point. Finish the floor, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went back to the house. Christmas in Red Hollow that year was modest, the way it always was in a frontier town that had no particular resources to spare for spectacle. There was a gathering at the Calloway place, which Ruth hosted with the same energy she applied to everything. Plentiful food, a warm fire, enough people crowded into not quite enough space to create the specific cheerful discomfort of a well-attended winter celebration. Evelyn and Daniel went together. This was the first time they had appeared publicly as a couple in any context that was not a functional errand in town, and she was aware of it in the way you were aware of a new pair of boots. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present, noticeable, something she was still calibrating to. The gathering was full of people she had known her whole life, ranchers and their families, the school teacher, the doctor, the man who ran the feed store and had known her father since before she was born. They had all watched her manage her father's decline, and then his death, and then the crisis of the bank, and they had managed their knowledge of her marriage the way small communities manage things they weren't sure about, with a careful combination of curiosity, concern, and the frontier pragmatism that understood a woman in Evelyn's position did what she had to do. What she had not anticipated was how they would receive Daniel. She should have, she thought later. She should have understood that a man who had once worked in this valley, who had apparently not forgotten a single thing about it in 15 years, who had come back and paid a debt and quietly set about making one of the hardest hit ranches in the area functional again, that such a man would not go unnoticed. Thomas Carter had been respected in this valley. The people who had respected him were watching what was happening on his land, and what they saw was a man who worked it the way Thomas had, with seriousness and care and no need for applause. George Hadley, who ran the operation adjacent to theirs and had been her father's closest neighbor for 30 years, found Daniel by the fire at some point in the evening and spent 20 minutes talking to him about the winter grazing situation on the North Ridge. Evelyn caught pieces of it from across the room, Daniel listening more than talking, asking precise questions, contributing observations that made Hadley lean in with interest, and felt something settle in her chest that she identified after a moment as pride. Not possessive pride. Not the kind that said, "Look what I have." The kind that said, "Look who this is." Ruth appeared at her elbow. "He's going to be all right here," she said quietly, watching the same conversation. "I know," Evelyn said. "Do you?" Ruth said, in the way that meant she was asking something more specific. Evelyn looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I actually do." Ruth put an arm around her briefly, the way she had done since they were girls, and then moved off toward the food table with her usual forward momentum, and Evelyn stood by the wall with her cup and watched Daniel Hart move through a room full of people he was meeting for the first time, conducting himself with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and felt the last of the distance she had been maintaining close, not with drama, but with the simple, irreversible logic of a thing that has been going in one direction long enough to arrive. It was the week after Christmas when the thing happened that Evelyn had not planned for and could not have predicted, and which turned out to matter more than almost anything else. She was going through her father's papers, the personal ones, not the ledgers, the ones she had been putting off because going through a dead person's private papers was the kind of work that required more composure than she always had available. She had been doing it in pieces, an hour here and there, making herself sit with the accumulated evidence of her father's interior life and accept each piece of it without trying to sort it into something manageable before she was ready. She found the letter near the bottom of the third box. It was addressed to her, in her father's handwriting, dated about 8 months before he died, before the diagnosis, before the debt had reached its crisis point, before anything had happened that would have explained why he might have been thinking about the things the letter contained. He had written it in the ordinary course of things, apparently, for reasons that had nothing to do with urgency or emergency. She sat on the floor of the small office and read it. It was a long letter. Her father, who spoke sparingly, wrote with a thoroughness that surprised her still after years of receiving his occasional correspondence. He wrote about the ranch, and about what he hoped for it, and about her, and about what he hoped for her, which was not, he was careful to say, anything specific. He did not have a particular vision of her future that he was attached to. He had, he wrote, learned from watching her grow up that she was considerably better at knowing what she needed than he was at predicting it, and he had decided early to trust that. But there was one thing he had written near the end of the letter that stopped her. There was a boy who worked here the summer you were 11, he wrote. I have thought about him over the years more than you might expect. He was 12 years old, and he had nothing, and he worked as hard as any man I ever hired, and he was careful with everything, the animals, the equipment, the land. Careful the way only certain people are, the way that comes from understanding the value of things you have not always had. I often wondered what became of him. I hope he found his way to something solid. Boys like that deserve to. Evelyn sat on the floor of her father's office for a long time. She read the paragraph again and again. Her father had remembered him, had thought about him over the years, had written, in the quiet ordinary course of a letter to his daughter 8 months before he died, that he hoped that boy had found his way to something solid. She folded the letter carefully. She held it in both hands. She sat with the weight of the coincidence, or not coincidence, she did not have a word for what it was. The weight of the way the world occasionally arranged its pieces into a shape that meant something without anyone having planned it. A 12-year-old boy and a man who treated him decently, and a letter that was never sent until after everything had already happened, and a daughter sitting on a floor 23 years later holding the evidence that the thread had run both ways. She got up. She walked down the hall. She put on her coat. Daniel was in the south pasture checking the fencing. She could see him from the gate, a distant figure moving steadily along the fence line in the late afternoon light. She walked out to him through the frozen grass, her breath making clouds, and he heard her coming and turned. He registered her expression and said nothing, waiting. She held out the letter. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Read it," she said. "The last paragraph." He took the letter. He read it. She watched his face while he read, the stillness, and then something moving beneath the stillness, something that was not composure, but the effort that composure required when the thing you were reading was pulling at something very deep. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original lines, exactly, and held it out to her. She shook her head. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "He would have wanted you to have it," she said. "I'm certain of that." Daniel looked down at the letter in his hands. She watched him absorb this. The knowledge that Thomas Carter had remembered him, had written about him, had hoped for him. The knowledge that the man who had given a 12-year-old boy the specific and durable gift of being treated like someone worth treating well had carried that boy in his memory the same way the boy had carried his land. She watched something in Daniel Hart's face do the thing faces did when a person received something they had not known they were still waiting for. He pressed the letter against his chest briefly, the way she had pressed the tin box against hers in the cold barn weeks ago, without thinking about it, without ceremony, just the body's instinctive response to holding something irreplaceable. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then, "Thank you," he said. And the two words were the same as they had been at the kitchen table, weeks ago, coming from somewhere deep, tired from the journey. But this time there was something else in them, something that had been given back. "You found your way to something solid," she said quietly. He looked at her. "That's what he wrote," she said. "He hoped you had." "You did." She held his gaze. "You're standing on it." The afternoon light was going, the way winter light went, quickly, with no particular warning, the sun dropping behind the western ridge, and the cold deepening all at once. The mountains were turning from white to blue to gray in the fading day, and the fence line stretched out in both directions across the frozen ground, and the smoke from the house chimney was going straight up in the still air. Daniel looked at the land around them. His land, her land, their land, if she was going to be honest about it, which she had been making more and more effort to be. He looked at her. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet," he said. "I know what you were going to say," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You don't," he said gently. "Not exactly." She looked at him. He folded the letter once more, carefully, and put it in his coat pocket. And then he said, in the plainest voice she had ever heard a person use for a thing like this, no preparation, no performance, just the words, "I love you. I have loved you for a very long time. I don't say that to ask you for anything. I say it because I have been saying it in letters to a floorboard for 15 years, and I would like to have said it out loud at least once, to your actual face, before I run out of time." The frozen pasture was very still. Evelyn looked at him standing in the last of the winter light, with her father's letter in his pocket and 15 years behind him, and the full, unhurried truth of what he was on his face for the first time, without management or qualification. She thought about what Ruth had said. He means exactly what he said he meant. She thought about the fear and the feeling being the same thing. She thought about the size of what she was afraid of and what that meant about the size of what she valued. She crossed the distance between them. 3 steps, 4, not far at all when you were finally moving, and she put both of her hands against his chest, feeling the rough wool of his coat, and beneath it the warmth of a person who was real and present and had been waiting, patiently and without demand, for exactly this long. She looked up at him. "I know," she said, not dismissively, not carefully, as a statement of the truest thing she knew. "I know you do." He put his hand over both of hers, where they rested on his chest. He did not pull her closer. He did not need to. He simply covered her hands with his and held them there, in the cold, and looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the kitchen window's reflection weeks ago and had been trying to name ever since. She could name it now. It was the expression of a man looking at something he had built, something he was proud of, not possessive, just glad it existed. Her father's expression, offered back to her by the boy her father had remembered. She felt the grief and the love arrive together, the way they always did now, and she let them both be there without trying to separate them, because they were, she had finally learned, the same thing in different clothes. You loved what you had lost because you had loved it when you had it. The love was the evidence of the loss, and the loss was the evidence of the love, and both of them were proof that something real had existed, and something real was existing now. She turned her hands over beneath his and held on. A pause. January came in hard and cold and stayed that way, the way January did in the Wyoming Territory. Not apologetically, not with any interest in what you might prefer. The valley went white and silent, and the mountains stood above it all with the particular indifference of very old things that have seen every variety of human situation and have concluded that it will sort itself out. The ranch sorted itself out. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect in a working operation on the frontier, where weather and equipment and markets made any plan a starting point for improvisation. The gray horse threw a shoe in the 3rd week of January, and Daniel spent 2 mornings with the farrier getting it right. A section of the east pasture fence went down in a windstorm, and they fixed it together in the cold, handing tools back and forth without needing to discuss the method, falling into the working rhythm that had been developing between them since the beginning and had, by now, the smoothness of something long practiced. A letter came from Gerald in Missouri, congratulating her on the marriage, 7 weeks late and characteristically useless, and she read it aloud to Daniel at supper, and they both found it funnier than it deserved to be. She moved her things. She did it on a Sunday, without ceremony, without announcement, carrying an armful of her belongings down the hall to the room that had been his, and rearranging them with the practical focus she applied to any task worth doing. He was in the parlor reading when she started, and he put the book down and came to stand in the doorway, and she continued rearranging without looking at him because if she looked at him, she would stop, and she did not want to stop. "You don't have to rush," he said. "I'm not rushing," she said. "I'm being decisive. There's a difference. Is there something I can carry?" "The blue trunk from the back of Father's room," she said. "It's heavier than it looks." He went and got the trunk. They rearranged the room together in the practical and slightly chaotic way of two people combining the accumulated objects of two separate lives into a shared space. There were disagreements. She had opinions about where things should be, and so did he, and they were not always the same opinions, but the disagreements had the quality of the pasture rotation argument, the quality of two people who respected each other's reasoning enough to engage it rather than manage around it. They arrived at a configuration that was neither of their original visions and was better than both. Late in the afternoon, when the last box had been unpacked and the room had settled into its new arrangement and the light outside was going gold against the snow, she sat on the edge of the bed and he sat beside her and they looked at the room together in silence for a moment. "I want to plant something in the spring," she said. "In the south yard. There was a kitchen garden there when I was a girl, my mother's. It's been empty for 15 years. "What do you want to plant?" he said. "Everything," she said. "I want to start with everything and see what takes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a terrible approach," he said. "It's my father's approach," she said. "He always said you don't know what the land will hold until you put something in it." "He was right about a lot of things," Daniel said. "He was," she said. They sat together in the quiet room as the last light moved across the floor, and the house held them both without asking anything of either of them, and outside the snow-covered land went blue and still in the early January evening. She thought about the morning she had signed her name next to his on a certificate in a courthouse, in her gray dress, with no witnesses except a bored clerk and the gray sky pressing against the window. She had told herself it was a transaction. She had believed it completely. She had been wrong in the way that mattered most, not in any of the facts, but in the meaning she had assigned them. She was not wrong now. She was, in fact, more precisely right about more things than she had been in a very long time. "Daniel," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said. "Something small, something you haven't mentioned yet." He considered this with his usual seriousness. "I can't whistle," he said. She turned to look at him. "What?" "I have never been able to whistle," he said, with the dry precision that she had learned to wait for. "I have tried periodically for 30 years. It does not work. I have no explanation." She stared at him. "You work with horses every day," she said. "I know," he said. "You need to be able to whistle," she said. "I am aware of that," he said. "How have you been getting their attention?" "I have been walking up to them," he said, "and speaking." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she laughed, a real laugh, the full kind, the kind that came up from somewhere below the managed surface of things, and arrived without permission or preparation. She laughed and felt the warmth of it in her chest like the first real fire of winter, the kind that catches properly and means it, the kind that is going to last. He watched her laugh. He was smiling, a real smile, the kind she had been waiting months to see without management in front of it. The kind that went all the way to those eyes she had finally decided were gray or brown, or both depending on the light, which seemed like the right answer for a man who turned out to be more than one thing. She shook her head. She pressed the back of her hand briefly against her eyes, which were doing something she hadn't expected. 30 years, she said. 28, technically, he said. I started trying it too. She laughed again. He watched her laugh again. and the room was warm, and the land outside was still, and somewhere in the house the fire in the kitchen stove was doing what it was supposed to do, and the tin box sat on the parlor shelf in the company of a brass compass and a blurred photograph in a gray river stone, and the floorboard in the barn was new and solid and would hold for another 20 years. The spring came the way spring always came to the Wyoming territory. Not gently, not on schedule, but suddenly and with force, as if the land had been holding its breath for 5 months and finally let it go all at once. The snow came off the mountains in cold, rushing streams that filled the creek to its banks, and the cottonwoods along the water put out their first tentative green, and the pastures went from white to gray to brown to something that was almost, in the long afternoon light, the color of promise. Evelyn broke ground in the south yard on the 1st of April. She had spent the winter planning it, not obsessively, not with the driven quality of someone trying to fill a space, but with the particular pleasure of a project that exists for no reason other than that you want it. She had sketched it out in the margins of the ledger. She had talked about it at supper, when the talk turned to spring plans, and Daniel had listened and added small practical observations. The drainage in that corner, the sun angle in the afternoon, that improved the plan without taking it over. He was there the morning she started. He did not offer to take the shovel. He stood at the edge of the broken ground with his coffee and watched her work, and after a while he crouched down and began turning the soil alongside her, not because she needed the help, but because he wanted to be there for the beginning of it. They worked in the April morning with the mountains clear above them and the creek audible from where they knelt in the turned earth, and the air had that specific quality it only had in spring on the frontier, cold still, but carrying something beneath the cold, a suggestion, a potential, the smell of things that had been underground all winter beginning to think about rising. She sat back on her heels and looked at the turned ground. "My mother grew tomatoes here," she said, "and beans, and a patch of something she called Sweet William that wasn't practical at all, but she liked the color." "We should plant Sweet William," Daniel said. She looked at him. "It belongs here," he said simply. She looked back at the ground. She thought about her mother, who had died when she was young enough that the memory was more feeling than image. Warmth, and a particular smell, and the sense of being attended to completely. She thought about her father walking the fence line every evening with the mountains in front of him. She thought about a 12-year-old boy who had worked this ground and left something in it that turned out to be irretrievable. She thought about what it meant to be the keeper of a place. Not just the practical keeper, the owner, the operator, the one who maintained the fences and managed the livestock and kept the ledger accurate, but the full keeper, the one who held the accumulated meaning of it, the stories of the people who had worked it and loved it and left pieces of themselves in it. The summer the boy came, the evenings with her father, her mother's garden. She put her hand flat against the cold, turned earth. "We'll plant everything," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up at the mountains. They were the same mountains they had always been. Indifferent, enormous, permanent in a way that made every human arrangement look provisional by comparison. And yet the human arrangements went on. The fields were planted and tended and harvested. The fences were maintained. The children were raised. The stories were kept. And the mountains looked down at all of it with their ancient blankness, and the world continued anyway, obstinate and alive and full of the specific, unrepeatable weight of the things that had happened in it. She thought about a rusted tin box and 15 years of silence. She thought about a courthouse on a gray morning and a signature that had felt like a transaction and turned out to be a beginning. She thought about patience, not as resignation, not as the absence of wanting, but as the active and courageous decision to keep going in the direction of something true without demanding that it arrive on your schedule or in the form you had imagined. She thought about what it cost. She thought about what it gave back. She thought about the kind of love that did not announce itself, that did not perform or demand or claim, that simply continued through years and distance and silence, not because it was easy or because it was encouraged, but because it was, in some fundamental and inarguable way, what the person carrying it was made of. She had not believed, on the gray morning she signed her name, that she was entering anything other than a transaction. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in the most important way a person could be wrong, the way that requires you to revise not just your understanding of a situation, but your understanding of yourself. She was not the same woman who had stood at that courthouse window watching the sky press against the glass. She was someone who had been broken open by grief and necessity and the discovery of 15 years of folded paper, and had put herself back together with better materials, more honestly, with more willingness to include the things that were frightening alongside the things that were safe. She was, she thought, closer to herself than she had ever been. And she had arrived there in the company of a man who had always known, from a distance, from across years, from the evidence of a 12-year-old summer, that she was someone worth that kind of careful, permanent attention. Daniel was still beside her, turning the soil with his hands now, working the cold earth with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, his shoulder close to hers in the way that had become ordinary and was therefore extraordinary in the specific way that only ordinary things achieved, the way that meant you had made it to the other side of something, the side where the remarkable thing was no longer remarkable because it had become simply part of what your life contained. She picked up her shovel. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, side by side in the south yard of the ranch that had been her father's and was now theirs, turning the soil that had been under snow all winter and was ready now, finally, to receive whatever you were willing to put into it. The creek ran full and cold over its stones. The mountains stood above the valley. The cottonwoods put out their green. The first warm light of a Wyoming spring moved across the land in slow gold shapes, the way it had moved across it every April for as long as the land had been the land, patient and indifferent and beautiful, asking nothing and offering everything. Evelyn Hart, dug her hands into the earth of her father's land and felt it cold and real between her fingers, and thought, this is what solid feels like. This, right here. This ordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable morning. This man beside her. This ground beneath them both. This beginning that had been, if she was honest, if she was willing to trace it all the way back, 15 years in the making, and was only now, in the full light of a spring that had finally decided to arrive, becoming what it had always been trying to be. She had married a stranger on a gray morning in the frontier town of Red Hollow, and she had been wrong about almost everything she thought she knew at the time. And she was grateful, with a fullness she had not previously believed she was capable of, for every single thing she had been wrong about. The land stretched out around them, green beginning at the edges of the brown, and the sky above the mountains was the color of something opening, and the day was long, and there was work to do, and they did it together.